My HOA sent a fake cop to intimidate my grandfather into selling his home. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. He was just a retired building inspector who hummed Cold War folk songs and talked to a shovel. But when they triggered his trap, the entire neighborhood learned the truth about the quiet old man on the lake. I should have known something was different about my grandfather the day he started humming while digging holes in his backyard. William Chin, 78 years old, a retired building inspector, had lived in this lakeside house for 40 years. Most people his age complained about their backs when gardening. But Grandpa? He hummed Cold War-era folk songs and talked to his shovel like an old friend. The house itself sat on 2 acres of prime real estate. Developers had been eyeing it since the lake became trendy. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had survived far worse predators than suburban land grabbers. The trouble started 6 months ago when Karen Henderson got elected as the new HOA president. Karen was the kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and sent violation notices for Christmas decorations left up past January 2nd. But lately, her harassment had escalated beyond typical HOA power trips. She'd been sending official-looking letters about property compliance issues that didn't exist in any HOA charter I could find. More disturbing were the 2 previous break-in attempts. They were carried out by men wearing police-style uniforms who clearly weren't real cops. Real cops don't wear Nike sneakers or carry plastic radios that don't actually work. Trust but verify, like Reagan used to say, Grandpa muttered as he installed the 3rd hidden camera near his rare book storage shed. His technical knowledge was chillingly sophisticated for a retired building inspector. Who is this man? I thought I knew my grandpa. Most 78-year-olds struggled with smartphones, but he was configuring motion sensors and wireless networks like he'd done it professionally. When I asked where he learned surveillance techniques, he just smiled and said, "Building inspection taught you to notice things others missed." The legal groundwork was crucial. Grandpa had researched property law extensively, installing proper no trespassing and electric fence warning signs every 50 feet around his perimeter. Low-voltage electric fencing was perfectly legal in our county for livestock protection, and his 2 rescue goats provided the perfect cover story. The voltage was set to startle, not injure. But combined with his other preparations, it would serve a different purpose entirely. He wasn't just protecting his property anymore. He was setting a trap. During installation, we discovered fresh boot prints around his book storage area. Someone had been surveilling him, studying his routines, and mapping his property layout. These weren't random break-ins. Someone specifically wanted access to his old inspection records, though I couldn't understand why building permits from decades ago would matter to anyone. Grandpa grew quiet when I mentioned the footprints. He studied them with the intensity of someone reading classified intelligence reports. "You know what they call guys like me?" he asked while burying electrical cables along his fence line. "Old dogs with long tails." Karen's about to learn why that's not just a figure of speech. His laughter carried an edge I'd never heard before, like he was remembering private jokes from a different life. The way he examined the intruder's shoe impressions, analyzed their approach patterns, and calculated sight lines suggested skills that went far beyond municipal building inspection. That evening, as we finished connecting the electrical system, I asked him directly about his fears. For the first time since this whole situation began, his composure cracked slightly. "This house isn't just wood and concrete," he admitted, looking toward the lake where he used to sit with my grandmother. "It's the last place I can still hear her laugh in the kitchen. Feel her hand in mine on this porch. If they take this, they're not just stealing land. They're erasing her. And I won't let that happen." The vulnerability in his voice was genuine, but it was also strategic. Later, I would understand that showing me his weakness was part of a larger plan. The alarm system activated at 11:47 p.m. red LED lights flashed silently in his bedroom as motion sensors detected movement near the back fence. Unlike the previous 2 attempts, this time my grandfather was ready. He didn't rush to call the police or confront the intruder directly. Instead, he settled into his favorite armchair on the covered porch, positioned his night vision scope, and waited. He had the patience of someone who had spent decades in situations requiring absolute stillness. The trap was set. All that remained was watching it spring. The intruder moved with practiced stealth, but 40 years of experience had taught my grandfather to read body language in the dark. Through his night scope, he watched a man in a police-style uniform approach the back gate. It was the same figure from previous surveillance footage. This time, however, the reception would be considerably more memorable. Grandpa had spent the afternoon fine-tuning his electrical system. He calibrated voltage levels that would deliver maximum shock value without causing permanent damage. The legal warning signs were clearly posted, making any injury the trespasser's own responsibility. What happened next unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of stupidity and consequences. The fake cop reached for the gate latch exactly as predicted, and the electrical system responded with beautiful precision. Blue sparks erupted in the darkness as 12 volts of direct current coursed through his body. He was thrown backward, crashing into the decorative bird bath. His theatrical screams echoed across the lake, probably waking half the neighborhood. But the electricity was only the opening act in Grandpa's carefully planned performance. As the intruder arrived on the ground, cursing creatively, a secondary system activated. This system demonstrated my grandfather's true tactical sophistication. Hidden mist nozzles, disguised as lawn sprinklers, released a fine spray of invisible marking compound across the entire area. The substance was completely odorless and harmless to humans, but it contained fluorescent particles. These particles would bind to clothing, skin, and equipment for weeks. Under ultraviolet light, anyone contaminated would glow like a neon sign. More importantly, the compound was forensically trackable, creating an evidence trail that would lead back to whoever had hired this amateur. Posture analysis shows he's ex-military, Grandpa observed, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. Probably a private contractor. I just stared at him. Since when did he analyze posture? His assessment seemed unusually professional for someone whose career involved checking building permits and foundation measurements. Real cops would have called for backup immediately after being assaulted. This guy was desperately trying to escape without creating an official incident report. This confirmed what we already suspected about his legitimate authority. The intruder eventually managed to stagger away, leaving behind torn fabric on the fence and what looked like a small electronic device near the gate. After waiting 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return, Grandpa and I went outside to examine the evidence. The device was a sophisticated lockpicking tool, the kind used by professional burglars rather than opportunistic thieves. More interesting was what we found when we followed his blood trail to the property boundary. Tire tracks in the mud matched an expensive sedan, not a police cruiser. They're not after jewelry or electronics, Grandpa explained as we returned to the house. The target is my old inspection records. Specifically, the files I kept from the Sunset Hills development project 20 years ago. Someone very powerful wants those documents destroyed before they can cause problems. He led me to a study where dozens of filing cabinets contained decades of inspection reports, code violations, and correspondence with city officials. Most of it looked like boring paperwork, but apparently, some of those papers contained evidence of construction fraud and permit manipulation. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Janet Morrison, the HOA treasurer, appeared at our front door, looking genuinely frightened. Janet was a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone except my grandfather. She handed him a manila envelope with shaking hands, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting surveillance. "I printed these from Karen's email account," she whispered. "She's been corresponding with Development Solutions Incorporated for months. They're planning something big for this weekend." Inside the envelope were email printouts that revealed the scope of the conspiracy against my grandfather. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was actively coordinating with the development company to acquire his property through intimidation and legal manipulation. The emails discussed enhanced pressure tactics and references to cleaning up loose ends from previous projects. Most disturbing was a message thread about hiring specialized contractors to retrieve sensitive materials from his house. 30 people watching him dance around like he was practicing breakdance moves with the god of thunder, Grandpa chuckled, reviewing the security footage from multiple camera angles. The electrical system had worked flawlessly, and the hidden cameras captured everything in high-definition detail. But more important than the entertainment value was the legal evidence. We now had video proof of breaking and entering, plus documentation of a larger conspiracy to harass and intimidate a property owner. Janet revealed that Development Solutions had been pressuring Karen to expedite the acquisition of lakefront properties through whatever means necessary. The company had apparently used similar tactics in other communities, targeting elderly homeowners who might be vulnerable to legal intimidation or social pressure. What they hadn't anticipated was encountering someone with my grandfather's particular background and skill set. The weekend would bring escalated measures. According to the intercepted emails, Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for Saturday. Ostensibly, it was to address security concerns created by my grandfather's defensive measures. The real purpose was to create community pressure for his removal, painting him as a dangerous neighbor who threatened everyone's safety. She had even arranged for local news coverage, hoping to use public opinion as a weapon against him. But my grandfather was already 3 moves ahead in this chess game. He spent the remainder of the week making phone calls to people whose names he didn't share with me. He used phrases like operational parameters and evidence authentication. When I asked about his contacts, he simply said that building inspection had taught him the importance of maintaining professional networks. The pieces were falling into place for something much larger than a neighborhood dispute. Janet Morrison's hands trembled as she poured coffee in my grandfather's kitchen. But her voice was steady with determination. She had finally reached her breaking point. As HOA treasurer for 12 years, she'd watched the group become Karen Henderson's personal weapon. And what no one knew, Janet had been secretly documenting Karen's corruption for months. She was just waiting for the right moment to act. That moment had arrived when she discovered the true scope of the conspiracy against my grandfather. Karen isn't who she claims to be, Janet began, spreading additional documents across the kitchen table. Her real name is Karen Miller. She was a real estate broker until 15 years ago when she lost her license. Your grandfather was the building inspector who exposed her involvement in the Sunset Hills fraud. The revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't a random HOA power struggle. It was personal revenge, carefully planned and executed over more than a decade. Karen had changed her name, moved to our community, and worked her way into a position of authority with a single goal: destroying the man who had ruined her career. The Sunset Hills development had been Karen's masterpiece of corruption back in 2009. She had brokered deals for luxury homes built on unstable soil, falsified geological reports, and bribed city officials to approve permits that should never have been issued. When the first houses started developing foundation cracks within 6 months, my grandfather's investigation uncovered the entire scheme. His testimony sent 3 people to prison and cost Karen everything: her license, her reputation, her marriage, and her financial security. She had spent the last 15 years plotting her comeback. She humiliated me in front of the entire HOA board last month, Janet continued, her anger finally surfacing. Called me a senile old woman who couldn't balance a checkbook when I questioned the new fee structure. But I've been keeping 2 sets of books since she arrived. The official records she files with the state, and the real accounting that shows where the money actually goes. The evidence Janet had compiled was devastating. Karen had been systematically embezzling HOA funds, inflating maintenance contracts with companies owned by her associates, and using community money to pay for her personal legal expenses. My grandfather listened to Janet's testimony with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional debriefing. He asked specific, probing questions about Karen's communication patterns, her financial backing, her relationships with local officials. His interrogation technique wasn't just sophisticated for a retired building inspector, it felt like something straight out of a spy movie. But Janet, too relieved to finally have an ally, didn't seem to notice. She was just happy to finally have someone take her concerns seriously after months of being dismissed and intimidated. Development Solutions offered her a partnership if she could acquire the lakefront properties, Janet revealed, producing another set of email printouts. They've been planning a luxury resort development for 3 years, but your property sits right in the middle of their target area. Karen convinced them she could handle the acquisition through HOA pressure and legal intimidation. If that failed, they were prepared to use more direct methods. The emails detailed a sophisticated harassment campaign designed to force elderly homeowners to sell at the low market prices. What emerged from Janet's intelligence was a pattern of criminal activity that extended far beyond our small community. Development Solutions had used identical tactics in at least 4 other lakefront areas, always targeting older residents who might be vulnerable to intimidation or unable to afford extended legal battles. They had successfully acquired dozens of properties through manufactured HOA violations, fake code enforcement actions, and social pressure campaigns. Karen was their specialist in community infiltration and psychological warfare. Tomorrow's emergency meeting isn't really about your security measures, Janet warned. Karen has arranged for the local news station to attend, and she's prepared a presentation calling for your immediate expulsion from the community. She's even got fake witness statements from neighbors claiming they feel threatened by her violent behavior. But here's what she doesn't know. I've been secretly recording HOA board meetings for 6 months. The recordings contained evidence of Karen's real agenda, including discussions about property values, development partnerships, and strategies for removing problematic residents. My grandfather's response to this intelligence briefing was telling. Instead of expressing surprise or anger, he seemed to be confirming information he already possessed. 40 years chasing international criminals, and now I have to deal with a suburban HOA president, he muttered almost to himself. The tradecraft is remarkably similar, actually. Infiltration, manipulation, psychological pressure, and elimination of opposition. The only difference is the stakes and the jurisdiction. His casual reference to international criminals caught both Janet's and my attention, but he continued without explanation. The next phase of Karen's plan involved social warfare designed to isolate my grandfather from community support. She had been visiting neighbors individually, spreading rumors about his mental stability and suggesting that his defensive measures posed a danger to their children. Several residents had already been convinced that he was becoming paranoid and potentially violent. The goal was to create enough community pressure that, even if legal action failed, social ostracism would force him to relocate. I need you to arrange something for me, my grandfather told Janet, pulling out a notepad and writing quickly. Instead of holding the meeting in the community center, we need to move it to the city council chambers. Make it a public hearing rather than a private HOA meeting. Tell them it's about community safety concerns that require official oversight. His strategic thinking impressed me. By moving the confrontation to an official venue, he would gain access to legal protections and procedural rules that wouldn't exist in an HOA-controlled environment. Janet agreed to use her treasurer authority to request the venue change, though she seemed nervous about directly opposing Karen's plans. My grandfather assured her that after tomorrow night, Karen's ability to retaliate would be severely limited. He spent the remainder of the evening making more phone calls, using phrases like evidence coordination and operational timeline. When I asked who he was calling, he smiled and said that building inspection had taught him the importance of proper documentation and official oversight. The trap was expanding beyond simple property defense. What had started as protection against break-ins was evolving into a comprehensive counterattack against an organized criminal conspiracy. Karen thought she was dealing with a vulnerable elderly man who could be intimidated into submission. She was about to discover that some retirees have more dangerous hobbies than golf and gardening. The confrontation arrived at my grandfather's front door precisely at 9:15 a.m. It was announced by the aggressive sound of expensive car doors slamming in his driveway. Karen Henderson emerged from a black Mercedes sedan, accompanied by 2 men in poorly fitted business suits. They carried themselves with the subtle arrogance of people accustomed to intimidating others through physical presence rather than legal authority. Their timing was deliberate, calculated to catch my grandfather off guard during his morning routine. What they didn't realize was that he had been expecting this visit since Janet's warning and had spent the previous evening preparing for exactly this type of psychological assault. Mr. William Chin, Karen announced with theatrical formality, holding up an official-looking document as she approached the front porch. "We have a court order authorizing the inspection of your property for dangerous electrical installations that pose a threat to community safety." Her voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who had successfully used fake authority to intimidate previous victims. The two men flanked her like bodyguards, clearly intended to create an atmosphere of official enforcement rather than neighborly discussion. My grandfather invited them all inside for tea. It was a gesture of hospitality that immediately disrupted their intended power dynamic. The psychological chess match began the moment they entered his living room. Karen attempted to establish dominance by refusing the offered refreshments and launching into a prepared speech about community standards and legal compliance. "Mr. Chin, or should I say Mr. William, we both know this isn't really about electrical safety," she began, dropping his first name with familiar contempt. "You've been causing problems for this community long enough, and now you've escalated to violence against law enforcement officers. This time I have proper legal backing and the resources to see this through to completion." My grandfather's response was masterful in its calculated calm. Miss Karen Miller," he replied, emphasizing her real surname while pouring himself tea with steady hands. "Or is it Henderson this week? I must admit, your commitment to reinvention is impressive. Most people who lose their professional licenses over construction fraud simply find different careers. But you've chosen the more challenging path of elaborate revenge schemes spanning multiple decades." The color drained from Karen's face as she realized her carefully constructed new identity had been penetrated. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her composure was already cracking. The two men beside her exchanged glances, clearly unaware of their employer's criminal history and suddenly uncertain about their legal authority in this situation. My grandfather stood and walked to his desk. He retrieved a thick manila folder that he placed carefully on the coffee table between them. "The Sunset Hills Development Project, 2009. Falsified geological surveys, bribing city officials, and selling homes built on unstable foundations. Your testimony during the fraud investigation was quite memorable, actually." Karen's mask of official authority completely disintegrated as the past she had tried to bury came flooding back into the present. "You destroyed my life," she hissed, abandoning any pretense of professional conduct. "I lost everything because you meddled. My career, my marriage, my reputation, everything I had worked for. You had no right to interfere with legitimate business practices." Her admission of personal motivation transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation, revealing this as a revenge operation rather than a community safety issue. Legitimate business practices don't typically result in federal prison sentences, my grandfather observed mildly while secretly activating a recording device hidden beneath his desk. "But I'm curious about something, Karen. How exactly did you convince these gentlemen that they possess legal authority to conduct property inspections? Are they licensed building inspectors, state-certified electrical contractors, or just well-dressed intimidation specialists?" He addressed the two men directly, forcing them to consider their own legal vulnerability in this deception. The larger of Karen's companions shifted uncomfortably as the legal implications became clear. "She told us you had attacked a police officer and that we were authorized to conduct a safety inspection," he admitted. "We're private security contractors, not government officials." His partner nodded nervously, clearly realizing they had been misled about the nature and legality of their assignment. My grandfather smiled and picked up his phone to dial the local police department, offering to have their credentials verified immediately. "That won't be necessary," Karen interrupted quickly, recognizing that official scrutiny would expose her deception. She pivoted to a different strategy, attempting to regain control through social manipulation rather than fake legal authority. "The entire community knows what you did to that poor security guard. People are frightened of you now. Parents are keeping their children indoors because they're afraid of what you might do next. You can't terrorize an entire neighborhood and expect to get away with it." My grandfather's response demonstrated psychological techniques he had learned during what I was beginning to suspect was a far more interesting career than building inspection. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Karen, but it requires careful cultivation to be effective. You've been working to isolate me from community support through carefully orchestrated rumors about my mental stability and potential for violence. Classic psychological warfare tactics, actually. The Soviet training manual from 1987 described identical techniques for neutralizing troublesome dissidents through social pressure campaigns. The reference to Soviet tactics caused both men to step backwards slightly. They were suddenly realizing they might be dealing with someone whose background was considerably more complex than a retired building inspector. Karen's eyes widened as she processed the implications of his knowledge about psychological warfare methodologies. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're just a small-town bureaucrat who got lucky catching some construction fraud 20 years ago." 47 years ago, the CIA established a program for training domestic investigators in counterintelligence techniques. My grandfather continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. The idea was to help local officials recognize and respond to foreign influence operations in their communities. Building inspection provided excellent cover for that type of work, actually. You learn to notice things that don't belong, people who aren't what they claim to be, documents that contain subtle inconsistencies. He gestured toward the court order Karen had presented, which was now obviously fraudulent to anyone paying attention. Karen realized her psychological warfare had backfired catastrophically. Instead of intimidating a vulnerable elderly man, she had walked into a trap set by someone with professional training in the exact type of manipulation she was attempting. Her two companions were already moving toward the door, recognizing that their involvement in this deception could result in criminal charges. "This isn't over," she warned, falling back on generic threats as her carefully planned intimidation campaign collapsed around her. "Actually, it is," my grandfather replied, showing her his phone screen, which displayed an active call to Detective John Miller of the County Sheriff's Department. "I've been recording this entire conversation, and John is particularly interested in people who impersonate government officials or threaten community members with fraudulent legal documents. He should be arriving shortly to discuss your creative approach to property acquisition." Through the front window, we could already see police cruisers turning into the driveway. Karen's final gambit was pure desperation masked as a confident threat. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with," she declared. "Development Solutions has connections throughout the state government. We have lawyers, politicians, and judges on our payroll. This little neighborhood dispute is just the beginning of your problems." But her voice shook as she spoke, and the arrival of actual law enforcement officers effectively ended any remaining illusion of her authority or control over the situation. As Detective Miller took Karen's statement and examined the forged court documents, my grandfather pulled me aside with a quiet observation. "Sometimes the best defense is allowing your enemies to attack you in exactly the way you want them to attack you," he said. Karen's need for personal revenge made her reckless. Instead of staying in the shadows and using legitimate HOA procedures, she exposed herself through confrontation. Now we have everything we need to destroy not just her, but the entire criminal organization she represents. The phone calls began immediately after Detective Miller escorted Karen away in handcuffs, charged with fraud, impersonation of government officials, and criminal intimidation. My grandfather spent the next 6 hours making contact with people whose names he had never mentioned during the 40 years I had known him. Each conversation followed the same pattern: brief identification using what sounded like code phrases, concise situation reports delivered in bureaucratic language, and requests for specific types of assistance that suggested a network of professional relationships spanning decades. The precision of his communications suggested someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations across multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Detective John Miller arrived at our house that evening, not in his official capacity, but as someone responding to a personal favor request from an old friend whose expertise had proven invaluable in previous investigations. He was a compact man in his 50s with the observant eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and reading people's intentions during high-stakes situations. "Willie called me 20 years ago when my partner got killed during a drug bust," he explained over coffee in our kitchen. His voice carried the weight of shared history and professional respect. "Said he had information about the supplier network that might help us roll up the whole operation." Never asked how a building inspector knew so much about international narcotics trafficking, but his intelligence was perfect. We arrested 43 people and seized 12 million in assets based on his analysis. The second member of our growing coalition was Rebecca Foster, a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes who drove up from the state capitol the next morning in response to my grandfather's overnight phone call. Rebecca was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confident precision of someone accustomed to dismantling complex criminal organizations through patient legal strategy and meticulous evidence compilation. Your grandfather's call came at an interesting time, she told me while reviewing Janet's financial documentation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen similar patterns in dozens of previous cases. We've been investigating development solutions for 18 months as part of a multi-state racketeering case. Their pattern of targeting elderly property owners through HOA manipulation has generated complaints in 7 different jurisdictions, but we've never had access to this level of insider documentation before. Jake Wilson, the investigative reporter, represented the third pillar of my grandfather's comprehensive counter-strategy against organized criminal activity. Jake had built his career exposing municipal corruption and corporate fraud through meticulous research and strategic media timing that maximized public impact while supporting law enforcement prosecutions. Willie taught me how to follow paper trails back in 1995 when I was just starting as a journalist, he explained. Spreading Development Solutions corporate documents across our dining room table with the systematic approach of someone who had learned to recognize significant patterns in complex financial records. I was investigating a city council bribery scandal that seemed impossible to prove until he showed me how to trace shell company connections and offshore banking relationships. The story won me a Pulitzer and sent 6 people to federal prison. The intelligence picture that emerged from our expanded investigation revealed Development Solutions as significantly more sophisticated than a simple real estate scam operating at the community level. They functioned through a network of subsidiary companies, shell corporations, and professional service providers that specialized in acquiring properties through legal intimidation and regulatory manipulation across multiple states. Their standard operating procedure involved infiltrating HOA boards, creating manufactured violations, and using psychological pressure campaigns to force sales at below-market prices. Karen's personal vendetta against my grandfather had made her careless and exposed patterns of behavior that would normally remain hidden from law enforcement scrutiny. Rebecca's federal investigation had documented similar operations in Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, always targeting lakefront or coastal properties with high development potential that could be acquired cheaply and resold for enormous profits. They're particularly effective against elderly homeowners who might be intimidated by legal threats or unable to afford extended litigation against well-funded corporate opponents. She explained with the clinical precision of someone who had prosecuted dozens of similar cases. Most victims simply sell rather than fight, especially when the harassment escalates to include fake code enforcement actions and manufactured safety violations. Your grandfather's resistance has disrupted their entire operational model for this geographical area. The scope of the criminal enterprise extended beyond simple property acquisition into sophisticated money laundering operations and systematic political corruption at the municipal and county levels. Development Solutions had systematically bribed local officials, manipulated zoning decisions, and used legitimate business fronts to conceal the proceeds of their real estate fraud while expanding their influence over regulatory processes. Jake's investigation had uncovered financial connections between Development Solutions executives and organized crime figures involved in construction industry racketeering throughout the southeastern United States. This isn't just about your grandfather's house, Jake emphasized, his voice carrying the excitement of a journalist who had stumbled onto a story with national implications. They've been using HOA manipulation as a front for a multi-million-dollar criminal organization with tentacles reaching into state government. My grandfather's strategic response was characteristically methodical and comprehensive, reflecting decades of experience in planning operations that required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Rather than simply defending against Karen's immediate threat, He was positioning our evidence to support Rebecca's federal prosecution while ensuring that Jake's media coverage would expose the broader pattern of criminal activity to public scrutiny. The goal isn't just to win this specific battle, he explained during our evening strategy session, spreading maps and organizational charts across his desk like a military commander planning a complex assault. We need to destroy their entire operational capability and send a message that this type of predatory behavior carries serious consequences that extend far beyond local law enforcement. Janet's intelligence contribution proved invaluable for understanding the local conspiracy structure, timeline, and communication patterns that would be essential for federal prosecution. Her secretly recorded HOA board meetings documented Karen's coordination with development solutions representatives, including detailed discussions about property valuations, acquisition strategies, and specific methods for intimidating resistant homeowners into compliance. She actually bragged about previous successful operations during our closed-door sessions. Janet reported with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to reveal Karen's criminal admissions. Said she had perfected techniques for making elderly property owners feel isolated and vulnerable until they were grateful to accept any reasonable purchase offer, no matter how far below market value. The psychological profile that emerged from our investigation revealed Karen as a particularly dangerous type of criminal. Someone whose personal grievances had evolved into systematic predation against vulnerable victims who reminded her of past humiliations. Her 15-year campaign for revenge against my grandfather had provided her with the motivation and tactical experience necessary to develop into development solutions' most effective acquisition specialist. Revenge is a powerful motivator, Rebecca observed with the clinical detachment of someone who had studied criminal psychology for professional purposes. But it also creates predictable behavioral patterns that can be exploited by people who understand how personal vendettas affect decision-making processes. Detective Miller's background investigation into Karen's known associates had revealed disturbing connections to several unsolved cases involving suspicious property transfers and unexplained deaths among elderly homeowners who had initially refused to sell their properties to development solutions representatives. 3 different cases in the past 5 years where resistant property owners died in apparent accidents shortly after being targeted by development solutions harassment campaigns. He reported with the grim professionalism of someone who had seen too many coincidences to believe in coincidence. House fires, falls downstairs, and medical emergencies that occurred during periods of high stress caused by legal intimidation could be coincidental, but the pattern is troubling enough to warrant federal investigation. My grandfather's response to this intelligence was telling in its professional detachment and analytical precision. Escalation to violence typically indicates that standard intimidation methods have failed and the organization is facing operational pressure from higher-level leadership. He observed with the clinical vocabulary of someone who had studied organizational behavior in criminal enterprises. Karen's personal investment in this particular target made her more aggressive than usual, but it also made her sloppy and exposed operational methods that would normally remain hidden. Tomorrow's public hearing will provide the perfect controlled environment for exposing not just the local conspiracy, but the entire criminal organization. The city council chambers filled beyond capacity by 7 p.m. It transformed into an amphitheater of community drama that would determine the fate of multiple criminal enterprises operating across state lines. Jake Wilson's media connections had ensured coverage from 3 local television stations and 2 regional newspapers. Rebecca Foster's federal contacts had arranged for FBI financial crime specialists to observe from designated seats near the front of the chamber. What most attendees didn't realize was that they were about to witness the culmination of a counterintelligence operation that had been months in the planning, orchestrated by someone whose expertise in exposing criminal organizations extended far beyond municipal building inspection. Karen Henderson arrived fashionably late. She was accompanied by a legal team that included 2 attorneys from the state capitol and a public relations specialist whose primary responsibility was managing media narrative during corporate crises involving federal investigations. She had clearly invested significant resources in tonight's presentation, bringing professional-grade audiovisual equipment and printed materials designed to support her characterization of my grandfather as a dangerous community threat. Her confidence was evident in every gesture as she set up her presentation equipment, clearly believing that public pressure and media attention would force a resolution in her favor. The formal proceedings began with Janet Morrison reading the official HOA complaint against my grandfather. It alleged that his security measures violated community safety standards and created an atmosphere of fear. Several neighbors testified about feeling intimidated by his defensive preparations, though their statements contained identical phrases and rehearsed emotional beats that suggested coordinated coaching. Karen's attorneys emphasized the legal liability issues created by electric fencing and surveillance equipment, painting a picture of an unstable elderly man who had escalated a minor dispute into potential violence. Karen's multimedia presentation was professionally crafted and emotionally manipulative. It featured edited video footage of the electrocution incident, carefully processed to remove all context about criminal trespassing by individuals impersonating law enforcement. She had assembled testimonials from neighbors expressing fear for their children's safety, photographs of the warning signs that she characterized as threatening, and expert testimony from a psychiatrist who had never met my grandfather but was willing to speculate about his mental state. Ladies and gentlemen of this community, Karen addressed the packed chamber with practiced authority. We are dealing with a resident who has chosen violence over dialogue, intimidation over cooperation. Mr. Chen's actions represent a clear and present danger to our neighborhood safety, our children's welfare, and our property values. The evidence speaks for itself. He has weaponized his property against innocent people and shown no willingness to participate in reasonable community standards. Her presentation was compelling, and several audience members nodded in agreement, clearly swayed by the professional quality of her materials. The turning point came when Karen invited questions from the audience, confident that she had successfully controlled the narrative. My grandfather stood slowly, his 78-year-old frame commanding attention through quiet dignity. "Miss Henderson," he began conversationally, his voice carrying across the chamber with surprising authority. "Or should I continue using your married name since we both know your real name is Karen Miller? Do you remember the Sunset Hills development project from 2009? And would you like to explain to this audience how that investigation affected your real estate career?" The color drained from Karen's face as her carefully constructed new identity began crumbling in front of the television cameras. Her attorneys looked confused and alarmed, clearly unaware of their client's criminal history and the personal vendetta that motivated this entire proceeding. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Sunset Hills was your masterpiece of construction fraud and regulatory manipulation," my grandfather continued methodically, producing a thick file folder. He placed it on the podium with the deliberate ceremony of someone presenting evidence. "Falsified geological surveys, bribed city inspectors, homes built on unstable foundations that started developing structural cracks within 6 months. 3 people went to federal prison because of that investigation, and you lost your real estate license permanently. But apparently, prison time and professional disgrace weren't sufficient deterrents for someone committed to organizing a 15-year revenge campaign against the investigator who exposed your criminal activities." The audience began murmuring as the implications became clear. Their understanding of the evening's events was shifting from community safety concerns to a personal vendetta disguised as civic responsibility. The media representatives were suddenly paying much closer attention, realizing they were witnessing a story with implications far beyond neighborhood politics. My grandfather's tactical brilliance became evident as he systematically dismantled Karen's presentation using her own equipment. Miss Miller carefully edited the security footage to remove the context that would explain my defensive measures, he explained, replacing her manipulated video with the complete recordings from multiple camera angles. "What you're seeing now is the 3rd attempt by individuals wearing fake police uniforms to break into my property and steal specific documents. Real law enforcement officers don't wear Nike sneakers, carry plastic radios that don't function, or flee the scene without filing incident reports." The unedited footage was devastating to Karen's narrative. Instead of watching an unstable man attacking innocent people, The audience observed criminals attempting to burglarize private property while impersonating law enforcement. The electrical defense system was revealed as a reasonable response to repeated criminal activity. But here's the most interesting part of tonight's presentation, my grandfather continued. He produced a handheld ultraviolet light from his jacket pocket. The fluorescent marking compound that my security system applies to trespassers remains detectable for several weeks after exposure. I wonder if anyone in this room tonight might have been contaminated during recent illegal activities on my property. He activated the UV light and swept it slowly across the audience. When the beam reached Karen's legal team, one of the attorneys began glowing with bright fluorescent patches on his clothing, hands, and briefcase. He was clearly visible to everyone in the chamber. The same man who had accompanied Karen during her intimidation visit was now exposed as the fake police officer who had attempted burglary just days earlier. The collective gasp from the audience was audible as they realized they were witnessing real-time evidence of a criminal conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Rebecca Foster, standing and displaying her federal prosecutor credentials to the television cameras. "I am Rebecca Foster from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I have been investigating Development Solutions Incorporated as part of a multi-state racketeering case involving organized criminal activity targeting elderly homeowners. What you have witnessed tonight constitutes evidence in an ongoing federal criminal investigation." FBI agents began moving through the audience, having received their predetermined signal to initiate arrests. Karen's final desperate gambit was pure panic. "This is impossible," she screamed as federal agents approached with handcuffs. Her voice cracked with desperation. "You can't prove anything. Development Solutions has lawyers, political connections, and judges on our payroll throughout this entire state government. This is just a neighborhood dispute." Her public confession to political corruption was being recorded by multiple television cameras and would become key evidence in the expanded federal investigation. The weeks following Karen's arrest brought a satisfaction that extended far beyond personal vindication. Development Solutions collapsed within 72 hours as federal agents seized their assets and arrested 17 executives across 4 states. Rebecca Foster's prosecution team used our evidence as the foundation for a RICO case that ultimately sent 43 people to federal prison and recovered over $80 million in fraudulently acquired properties. The criminal organization that had terrorized elderly homeowners throughout the Southeast was permanently dismantled. Janet Morrison was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, bringing an end to the manufactured violations and harassment campaigns. The neighbors who had been manipulated into supporting Karen's vendetta organized a neighborhood barbecue in my grandfather's honor. It was a gesture of gratitude that provided the emotional payoff he had needed. Watching him laugh with the same people who had once viewed him as a threat, I finally understood how much the community's rejection had affected him, despite his professional composure. But the most significant revelation came 3 weeks later. My curiosity about his tactical sophistication finally prompted the conversation I had been avoiding. "Grandpa," I asked directly after dinner one evening, "building inspectors don't typically know counterintelligence techniques or maintain networks of federal prosecutors and FBI agents. Who were you really before you retired?" His response was a weathered photograph retrieved from his desk drawer. It showed a much younger version of himself in a formal suit, shaking hands with President Reagan in what appeared to be the Oval Office. "My real name is William Chin, and for 31 years I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency," he said with a matter-of-fact tone. "Domestic counterintelligence was my specialty, identifying and disrupting foreign influence operations within American communities. The building inspector position provided perfect cover for surveillance activities and access to municipal records." The photograph showed him receiving some kind of commendation, surrounded by officials whose faces I recognized from history books. The scope of his career became clear as he explained how domestic intelligence work had evolved during the Cold War. Soviet and Chinese intelligence services regularly attempted to infiltrate American communities through legitimate business fronts, particularly in real estate development. My job was identifying these operations and neutralizing them. What I had interpreted as luck or intuition was actually the application of professional expertise accumulated over 3 decades. I knew about Karen's real identity within a week of her arrival in our community, he admitted. Her background check revealed the connection to Sunset Hills, and her behavioral patterns suggested someone conducting a long-term surveillance operation. The only question was whether she represented a simple revenge scenario or something more sophisticated. His 6-month preparation period had been a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to gather evidence while allowing Karen to expose her criminal network. The electrical defense system wasn't just about protecting my property, he explained. It was bait designed to force her conspirators into revealing themselves through direct criminal activity that could be documented and prosecuted. Every defensive measure was calculated to escalate her response until she made mistakes that would expose the entire organization. The timing of our counterattack had been coordinated with Rebecca Foster's federal investigation, providing her with the local evidence needed to support broader RICO charges. Karen's 15-year revenge campaign had actually been anticipated and monitored by federal agencies. Once someone has been convicted of construction fraud and money laundering, they remain persons of interest to financial crimes investigators, my grandfather explained. When Karen changed her identity and began targeting the same person who had exposed her, it created a perfect opportunity for a controlled investigation. The man in the dark suit who had observed our hearing was revealed as Deputy Director Harrison from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, someone who had worked with my grandfather on multiple cases. Harrison wanted to see if I was still capable of running a successful counterintelligence operation at my age. He admitted with obvious satisfaction. Apparently, some skills don't deteriorate as quickly as others. 3 months later, the full impact of our operation became clear. The Development Solutions investigation had uncovered connections to money laundering, political corruption, and organized crime. Our neighborhood dispute had triggered the dismantling of criminal networks that had operated for over a decade. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal. The fear that had motivated my grandfather's initial defense, his terror of losing the house that contained his memories of my grandmother, had been replaced by a sense of purpose and community, belonging that I hadn't seen since her death. The neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion now considered him a hero. So, what happens now? I asked as we sat on the porch where this entire adventure had begun. Now I grow flowers without electrifying them, he replied with genuine contentment. Though I might keep the security cameras. You never know when someone might try to steal my tomatoes. His laughter carried the satisfaction of someone who had completed his final mission. The only reminder of our recent adventure was a letter that arrived the following week from CIA headquarters, offering him a consulting position. He read it carefully, then placed it in the fireplace and lit a match. I'm truly retired now, he told me as the official letterhead turned to ash. From here on, I only fight weeds and maybe the occasional HOA president who gets too ambitious. But if any of you ever want to hear about the time your grandfather had to deal with a cult leader who tried to build a compound in the suburbs, that's a story for another day. Ever felt powerless against corrupt authorities or manipulative neighbors who think they can intimidate you? This story proves that intelligence and patience can defeat any bully, no matter how much power they have. Williams' counterintelligence techniques aren't just for retired CIA agents. The principles of documentation, strategic thinking, and legal preparation can protect anyone from predators targeting vulnerable homeowners. Has your HOA ever made you feel powerless? What would you do if you were in my grandfather's shoes? Let me know in the comments.